I'm always on the road and often pick up hitchhikers. My only rule: they have to share the scariest story they've ever heard, and now I'm going to retell it to you. Write in the comments what city you're listening from. I may have driven by it. I'll never forget that unsettling feeling when Leah and Mike, spinning the wheels of their wheelchairs, passed by me. They were as cheerful and positive as ever, but at that moment, I had a terrifying premonition of something relentless and horrific approaching, something that would turn their merry, mischievous, yet very fragile world into a nightmarish tragedy. The only thing I was wrong about was that this looming horror was not only about them, but everyone around. Today was my first day working as a lifeguard at the Aquatic Paradise Water Park in Illinois, a place where the laughter of children and the joy of adults should dispel any shadows. Leah and Michael, known to everyone in town as the sweetest and most positive couple, hadn't come here by chance. They were the special guests at the opening of a new attraction, the Cannibal Cabin. The water park had organized this day as part of a charity campaign. All proceeds were to go to help people with disabilities. Leah and Michael, always active volunteers in all socially important events, agreed to act as the first visitors to the attraction to demonstrate, quoting from the brochure, the exceptional safety and inclusivity of the water park. Cannibal Cabin loomed at the end of the park, like a monument from another time. Its walls, made of roughly hewn wood and Gothic details, resembled a horror movie set. A massive wooden sign hung above the entrance, featuring a fearsome face and crossed bones. Even the bright sun seemed to avoid this place, leaving it in shadow. The attraction, meant to draw visitors, only invoked in me a cold, clammy fear. They moved in their wheelchairs with an ease that seemed almost unnatural. They laughed and chatted, but there was something odd in their movements and glances. Their carefreeness did not soothe me. On the contrary, it only heightened my anxiety. As Leah and Michael approached the entrance, the shadows around them seemed to darken and become more distinct, though perhaps the stress was causing me what's called tunnel vision. Their wheelchairs glided smoothly, and all the while I wanted to shout, to stop them, but my voice vanished. My throat went dry, and I could only watch helplessly as they continued their journey. Cannibal Cabin was more than just an attraction. It was named after some local grim legend. Some locals liked the idea, others were against it as usual. But now the presence of the cabin felt like a weight pressing on my chest. Leah and Michael stopped in front of the entrance, exchanged a look, and smiled. When their wheelchairs crossed the threshold, I felt a strange change in the air. The world around seemed to plunge into a viscous, oppressive silence. The noise of the park, laughter, music, splashing water, suddenly became muffled, as if I were hearing it through a thick glass wall. The shadows cast by the setting sun seemed too long and incorrect, as if they lived their own life. Leah and Michael exchanged glances, their smiles strained. Michael looked back, and it seemed to me that he looked right at me, as if he too felt something. Leah shrugged slightly, as if deciding to ignore what was happening, and nodded towards the entrance. Their resolve did not waver. They moved forward, and their wheelchairs crossed the threshold almost simultaneously. I remained standing on my watchtower, unable to distract myself. All my thoughts were about Leah and Michael. I tried to focus on other visitors, but my gaze kept returning to the grim silhouette of the Cannibal Cabin. My premonition grew stronger with every minute they were absent. I realized something was wrong. My fellow lifeguards tried to distract me, attributing it all to the jitters of the first day, but I couldn't listen to them. My heart sounded an alarm, and every cell in my body screamed that I needed to do something. But what? What could I change? The minutes they were absent inside the cabin seemed like an eternity. My eyes returned again and again to the massive doors behind which they had disappeared. The feeling of anxiety inside me grew, consuming any other thoughts. I tried to distract myself by watching the other visitors, but even the most carefree of their movements could not drown out my unease. The evening light began to fade, turning the cabin into an ominous silhouette against the darkening sky. The weight was almost unbearable. When a scream erupted from the depths of the Cannibal Cabin, the air seemed to shatter into hundreds of thousands of sharp shards. It was not just a human cry. but a sound filled with pure terror and loss. A scream that penetrated directly into the soul and immediately conveyed the full depth of the pain and tragedy being experienced. It echoed throughout the park, causing visitors and staff to freeze in place. Even the water in the pools ceased to ripple from the wind, as if nature itself held its breath in anticipation. I quickly turned towards the cabin. A group of people rushed out of its doors, their faces pale, eyes filled with tears. Their movements were chaotic, as if trying to escape something unseen. But Leah and Michael were not among them. My heart sank, and my palms grew clammy. Gathering all my courage, I jumped down from the tower and ran towards the cabin. My legs felt like cotton, each step heavy with dread. I heard no voices or cries around me, only the pounding of my own heart. The closer I got, the stronger the smell became. It was a sharp, suffocating scent of burned plastic, mixed with something sweet and barely perceptible, the smell of decay. It hit my nose, causing nausea, but I kept going. Park staff had already gathered at the entrance to the cabin, their faces grim, eyes anxiously shining in the light of the newly turned-on dim lamps. A skinny technician with trembling hands approached me. His face was as pale as a sheet, and his eyes looked through me as if he was still trying to comprehend what he had seen. Something happened with the system, he stammered, his voice trembling. They were in the booth together. And he didn't finish his sentence because he suddenly shook. Another employee grabbed him by the arm and led him away. But I had heard enough. I knew I had to see everything for myself. I stepped over the threshold. Inside, the air was heavy and sticky, and the faint, flickering light created bizarre shadows on the walls. For a moment, it seemed the shadows moved, but I chalked it up to my tense imagination. My gaze darted across the walls, the floor, the unnaturally dark corners. Everything looked as though this place intentionally repelled any glimmer of light, any sign of life. I pressed on, feeling every cell in my body resisting the movement. The light from the sparse bulbs flickered, and in their light, I saw scattered items on the floor. Michael's glasses, broken and covered with something sticky. Leah's scarf, barely discernible in the dim light. They looked as though they had been discarded in an attempt to escape a trap. I bent down to pick up the scarf and felt my breathing quicken. The scarf was soaked with something wet and sticky, and I didn't want to think about what it was. Reaching the center of the attraction, I saw them. Leah and Michael lay on the floor, their hands tightly clasped together, their faces frozen in expressions of horror and pain, indescribable in words. Their eyes were open, but I knew that before death, they had seen something that left its mark in every bend, in every wrinkle. Their wheelchairs were overturned and crumpled, as if they had been thrown and crushed with extraordinary force, and around them lay fragments of metal parts that seemed to have once been part of the attraction's mechanism. I knelt beside them. My hands trembled, and tears flowed from my eyes, which I couldn't hold back. I touched Leah's hand. It was cold as stone. At that moment, I felt powerless, useless. All I could do was look at those I couldn't save. Noise from behind startled me. Sounds of footsteps and voices of staff who had finally gathered to figure out what had happened. I stepped back, allowing them to enter, but my heart remained there, next to them. Those two, who had laughed and enjoyed life that morning, and had shown the town how to rightly treat life and others, now lay motionless at the center of the grim, cannibal cabin, twisted and broken. Their death could not have been an accident. I felt that something dark was lurking behind all this, something that could not be explained by science or reason. When I stepped outside, the night seemed even darker than before. People around whispered, discussing what had happened, but I didn't hear them. The scream from the cabin still rang in my ears. This was just the beginning. Weeks after the tragedy, the aquatic Paradise water park came alive again. Crowds of visitors filled the attractions. Children's laughter drowned out the music from the speakers, and sunlight playfully sparkled on the water. However, for me, this noise was like an empty facade. Beneath the surface of the fun, an invisible crack was growing deeper every day. My colleagues seemed to have completely forgotten about the incident. At meetings, no one even mentioned Leah or Michael's names. Instead, discussions focused on plans for new promotions and discounts to attract visitors. The management pressured the local police to reopen the Cannibal Cabin attraction, as quickly as possible. Their indifference was suffocating. I couldn't believe that the deaths I had witnessed with my own eyes had become just an unfortunate accident that no one wanted to remember anymore. In the evenings, I often stayed alone by the pools, trying to find anything that might explain what was happening here. One evening, as the shadows began to blanket the park, I heard a strange sound. It was a faint, barely discernible scraping, as if someone were scratching the concrete walls. The sound came from a far corner of the park where no visitors should have been. I followed the sound, my heart beating rapidly, my hands trembling. Reaching the edge of the pool, I saw something odd. The water, usually clear, appeared murky, almost black. I leaned closer to examine it and saw a faint reflection, neither light nor movement. I recoiled, barely stifling a scream, but that wasn't all. On the wet tiles by the pool, I noticed footprints, small, bare footprints, as if a child had been running here. They led to the edge of the water and then disappeared. I peered into the darkness, feeling the cold seize my limbs. These footprints couldn't belong to any of the visitors. The park was closing, and everyone should have left. The next day, I tried to tell my colleagues about it, but their reaction was worse than I expected. They listened, nodding, but I saw hidden mockery in their eyes. They no longer took me seriously. My tales of strange events only alienated me further from them. In the locker room, I accidentally overheard a conversation between Dan and Tom. They were laughing about how I was going crazy, but what I heard next made me freeze. "Did you see that tile by the pool?" Tom asked. "Maybe it's just more hallucinations of our paranoid friend." "Oh, come on," Dan replied, his voice full of condescension. "It's just stains." Or, he paused, then giggled. "Maybe Mike and Leah's ghosts decided to play with us?" Their laughter was deafening. I couldn't listen anymore. Leaving the locker room, I headed to the part of the park where I had seen the strange footprints. The tile Tom mentioned was still wet, but now it bore thin, barely visible lines. I stood, staring at these strange patterns, when I heard a rustle behind me. Turning sharply, I saw nothing but dark shadows stretching towards the pool. The shadows moved too quickly for the setting sun. I felt my pulse quicken and my breathing become heavy. Then I heard it, a barely audible voice, a whisper coming from the water. It was as soft as the rustle of wind, but there was something threatening in it. The words were unclear, but I could swear I heard my own name. "Stephanie." I froze. The voice repeated, now louder, almost whispering directly behind me. I didn't turn around. Fear completely paralyzed me, my mind torn between two thoughts. Either I was truly losing my mind, or there was something here, something watching me and waiting for something. And if I wasn't going insane, maybe I should consider my colleagues' taunts from a different perspective. Despite these oddities, the water park lived its usual life. Visitors rode the slides, enjoyed the sun, and seemed oblivious to the underlying tension in the air. Even my colleagues, despite their recent mockery, began to behave differently. Now they looked at me not with disdain, but simply ignored me. One morning, as I passed by the cannibal cabin, I noticed a thin line of dark liquid seeping from under the door. It had a strange, metallic smell, akin to blood. I leaned in closer to examine it, but a colleague called out to me, and I hurried away. Yet that image haunted me all day. Later that same day, another inexplicable event occurred. I noticed a child standing at the edge of the pool, completely still, his eyes wide open, his gaze fixed on something distant. As I approached to ask if he was all right, he suddenly turned to me and said, "They haven't left. They're still here." His voice was quiet but chilling, as if he was not speaking in his own words. Moments later, his mother came, took his hand, and led him away without even glancing at me. But the child's words seemed to etch themselves into my mind. The next day, the park was abuzz with activity anew. Police cars surrounded one of the attractions, and my colleagues stood in groups, exchanging anxious whispers. My heart sank when I saw that the area was cordoned off, and police officers were walking around, taking photographs of something on the ground. I approached one of the lifeguards, whose pale appearance betrayed her horror, and asked what had happened. "James," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the cordoned-off area. He's dead." James was one of those who had mocked Leah and Michael's deaths. His sarcastic remarks about the screams and poses still rang in my ears, and now he himself had become a victim. According to witnesses, He slipped on the wet tiles near one of the pools, hit his head, and drowned. But the oddity was that the pool where it happened had been drained the night before for cleaning. There was no water there, yet James's body was found wet, his clothes soaked through. As I approached the scene to take a closer look, a new wave of horror washed over me. There were wet footprints on the tiles around the pool, but they weren't James's. They were too small, as if someone with child-sized feet had walked around before disappearing. My breathing quickened, and I stepped back, feeling my heart pounding wildly. These events could no longer be dismissed as mere coincidences. Everything pointed to something more than just accidents happening here, something that was hunting us, targeting those who worked in aquatic paradise. That night, I couldn't sleep. The faces of Leah, Michael, and now James haunted me in every sound, in every shadow that moved across the walls of my room. Their screams echoed in my thoughts, merging into a single agonizing symphony. A cold morning enveloped the water park in thick fog, which seemed to leach all color from it. The attractions stood like ghosts, their outlines barely discernible in the gray mist. The air was saturated with dampness, and each breath felt heavy. I walked on the wet tiles toward a new slide where Mark was supposed to finish installing some equipment. This attraction was just about to launch, and I hoped the morning bustle around it would bring some semblance of normalcy to the day. But as I approached the slide, I felt a tightening inside me. A strange silence hung in the air, broken only by my own footsteps. Expectations of hearing the workers' shouts, the sounds of tools, or just typical commotion went unmet. Instead, there was only a dead, oppressive silence. When I got closer, my heart stopped. At the base of the slide lay a body. It was motionless, and even from a distance, I could feel that something was wrong. Mark, always jovial and energetic, lay like a discarded doll, his arms spread out, his head twisted at an unnatural angle. His face was frozen in an expression of terror, his eyes open, capturing the same darkness I had seen in Leah and Michael's eyes. I stood frozen, feeling my legs turn to jelly. My heart pounded in my chest, but everything around me seemed to slow down. I slowly approached, feeling the chill creep up my spine. The tile beneath him was slippery, as if covered with a thin layer of water, yet there were no signs of morning rain or leaks. As I leaned closer to examine his wound, my gaze fell on his neck, a deep cut, strangely precise, as if made by something too thin and sharp, left me feeling that this could not have been an accident. The fog thickened, as if trying to hide what had happened. At that moment, I thought I heard a whisper, soft and barely discernible. It seemed to emanate from the ground itself, surrounding me from all sides. I looked around, but no one was nearby. Suddenly, the creak of metal made me start. I looked up and saw one of the handrails on the slide slightly sway, though the breeze was barely noticeable. Unable to stay there any longer, I screamed, calling for someone to help. My voice echoed off the nearby walls, and within minutes, other employees arrived. They stopped for a moment, seeing the body, and their faces contorted in horror. Someone began to call the police, and I stepped aside to give them space, but I couldn't take my eyes off Mark. "How did this happen?" whispered one of the employees, covering her mouth with her hands. Her voice trembled, as did her entire appearance. "It was an accident," said someone from the technical team quietly, though his voice lacked conviction. But I knew it was no accident. Too many coincidences, too many deaths. Something was happening in this park that could not be explained by logic or mere coincidence. The deaths of Leah and Michael, the strange footprints, James drowning in an empty pool, and now Mark. These were not just accidents. When I returned to the staff room, my mind was clouded with fear and a sense of looming threat. Colleagues whispered behind my back, their glances wary. I knew they felt something too, but none of them dared to speak about it out loud. Their masks of indifference were cracking, yet they still clung to them, as if they were their last chance to maintain normality. I sat alone for a long time, trying to gather my thoughts. The image of Mark's body, his eyes filled with terror, and those strange traces around him haunted me. Something in this park was awakening, something dark, something unstoppable. The next day, the water park opened its doors again, as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed for me. Every sound, every step on the wet tiles reminded me that death here was no accident. This place had become a cage, and I knew there was no way out. Aquatic paradise hid its secrets, but I swore to uncover the truth, even if it turned out to be more horrific than I could imagine. I walked the winding paths to the administrative block, where police officers had already gathered. My heart beat unevenly. I knew that another tragedy had occurred. The administrative block, always a place of order with its neat glass and strict lines of furniture, now looked like a scene from a nightmare. People stood in groups, their faces as white as chalk, and whispers spread through the corridors like waves of fear. I approached the service door where employees were gathered, but a security guard stopped me. His voice was restrained and tense. "It's better you don't go in there, Stephanie. It's horrible, but I needed to know." I insisted, and he reluctantly let me pass. My steps echoed down the corridor until I stopped in front of Mr. Dawson's office door. It was ajar, and I saw a pool of blood spread out on the floor. Mr. Dawson lay face down, his neatly pressed clothes now stained with blood. The papers that were always organized on his desk were scattered around, evidence of uncontrollable chaos. His hand was stretched forward, as if he was trying to reach something important in his final moments. I couldn't understand what he was trying to grab, but that pose made me feel a chill of horror. Around the body, police were gathering evidence, their faces focused, but their eyes showing fear. They whispered among themselves, making notes, photographing the traces on the floor. The air was thick with the smell of blood and something rotten, making it hard for me to breathe freely. I turned to Sheriff Grayson, who stood in the corner of the room, frowning. "How did this happen?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but it still trembled. "It looks like murder," he replied after a pause. "But we found no signs of struggle, no clues, no obvious motives. The door was locked from the inside, and the security cameras," he paused, as if afraid to voice it. "They didn't capture anything unusual." This revelation sent a shiver down my spine. The implications were terrifying. A murderer was among us, moving unseen, able to strike without leaving a trace. The park, a place designed for joy and laughter, had become a stage for a chilling mystery that I was determined to solve, no matter the cost. The icy knot in my stomach tightened. A locked door, cameras that saw nothing. It seemed impossible, but what struck me most was Sheriff Grayson, a man of impeccable reputation, looking defeated. He was the only one trying to see things as they were, not seeking rational explanations to calm himself. "We'll consider the possibility of a technical failure, but..." He hesitated, looking at me. "I have a feeling there's something more here. If you see anything suspicious, let me know, no matter what it is." I nodded, unable to speak. My intuition screamed that he was right. I looked again at Mr. Dawson's body, his outstretched hand, and the strange scratches on the floor that seemed to stretch from his chair to the door. Something here was amiss, not as it should be. As I left the office, the administration corridor felt like a labyrinth of shadows. The whispering of the employees behind me sounded louder than usual, but I couldn't make out a word. It all blended into a chaotic hum that echoed in my ears as I walked away. The following days became unbearable. After Mr. Dawson's death, the park definitively lost its cheerful facade. Visitors still came, but they were fewer. Those who remained avoided certain areas, especially the cannibal cabin. Even from the outside, the place was intimidating. Some claimed to hear strange sounds from within, like whispers or soft crying. Others said they saw shadows sliding past the windows, though the building remained officially closed. I could no longer ignore what was happening. The accidents, which the park management tried to pass off as coincidences, became part of a chain of events. It seemed the very land of this place was imbued with something dark and insatiable. One night, I had a nightmare. I saw Mr. Dawson standing before me, his hand still reaching forward, but now it pointed directly at me. His face was contorted with pain, and something else I couldn't describe in words. He opened his mouth to speak, but instead of words, a quiet, sinister laugh echoed in my ears, lingering even after I woke up. With each passing day, my fear and tension only grew. The atmosphere in the park became heavier, and I felt like I was becoming a part of it. My colleagues now looked at me warily, and some even avoided speaking with me. They thought my suspicions had jinxed the water park. I no longer felt part of the team, but that didn't matter to me anymore. All I wanted was to understand the chain of deaths, to prevent more suffering in the future. The sky was gray, and the fog was thick, as if nature decided to shield the park from human eyes. The maze, a new attraction that had recently opened, drew the visitors' attention. At first glance, it seemed harmless, winding paths made of shrubbery, lantern sculptures, and cozy gazebos. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark was hidden at its heart. As I stepped inside, the air changed. It was dense, saturated with the smell of damp earth and something else, elusive but unsettling. The sounds of the park fell away as if I had stepped into another world where time slowed down. I tried not to show my fear, but each step was difficult. The maze was quiet, but this silence did not bring peace. It buzzed in my ears like a death knell, warning me of danger. After a few turns, I heard a child's voice. It was so soft that at first I thought I had imagined it, but the voice repeated, and this time the words were clear. Help, ... It was a weak, trembling whisper, as if a child was calling for help but couldn't shout louder. My heart clenched, and I ran towards the sound without thinking about where my feet were taking me. The paths became narrower. The bushes seemed to close in around me, creating the feeling that I was trapped. When I reached the source of the sound, I froze. On the ground, near one of the labyrinth's walls, lay two teenagers. Their faces were unnaturally pale, their eyes wide open, and their mouths twisted in silent screams. It seemed something so terrifying had caught them that their bodies froze in poses of pure horror. I approached closer, my legs feeling weak. One of them, a boy, held a broken cell phone in his hand, its screen still glowing. Next to him was his sister. Her face was covered with a thin film of moisture, as if she had just emerged from water. But there was not a drop of water here, except on their clothes. It was impossible. I stood there, not knowing what to do. My mind refused to accept what I saw, but every moment spent in this place only intensified my fear. A dead silence hung in the air, and only the faint echo of their last screams still trembled. Suddenly I heard a creak. It sounded to my right, as if someone or something was moving behind the hedge wall. I quickly turned my head and saw narrow tracks on the ground. They looked like wheelchair tracks. My heart tightened. Michael's wheelchair. I couldn't be mistaken. This was exactly what I had seen earlier when he entered the cannibal cabin. The tracks stretched along the maze path, leading deeper. I felt a chill run through my skin. There was a desire in my chest to turn around and run, but I knew I had to go on. Something, like an invisible hand, was leading me further. I followed the tracks, and everything around me seemed even more unreal. The shadows began to move as if they had a life of their own, and the air became denser. My breathing quickened, and I felt sweat beads run down my back. The maze led me deeper, its paths becoming more tangled, and the bushes taller and denser. When I finally reached the exit, light hit my face. I burst outside, breathing heavily, and turned to look at the maze. It no longer seemed like a normal attraction. Now it appeared as a living organism, hiding its secrets behind dense green walls. In the distance, I heard clear children's laughter. It was a regular day for the water park visitors, but for me, this maze confirmed that aquatic paradise was hiding much more than it seemed. The faces of the teenagers and the tracks of the wheelchair did not leave my mind. All this could not be a coincidence. As I approached the cabin, a chill reminded me of every rustle that disturbed the grim silence of this place. The constant wind, which always seemed a bit colder near this cabin, felt especially piercing today. I walked slowly, looking around, when suddenly I saw Sheriff Grayson walking straight towards me on the path. "Good evening, miss," he began, stopping in front of me. His voice sounded tense, and his gaze was heavy and mysterious. "I noticed how you are inspecting this attraction. It seems rare for a park employee to show such interest in one particular attraction." "Yes, I recently started working here, getting used to everything, especially the unusual," I replied, trying to hide the tremble in my voice. "And honestly, this place, it seems particularly unusual to me." The sheriff nodded, continuing to scrutinize me. It seemed he wanted to ask something but hesitated. He slowly spoke, studying my reaction to his words. "This place indeed has its own history. Maybe you should know the truth about it if you are going to work here." I nodded silently, Feeling my curiosity mix with apprehension, the sheriff sighed and began his story. Long ago, back in the 90s, there was a family living in these woods, a family that would be better off forgotten. They were outcasts, living far from the hustle and bustle of the city. But their story is dark and cruel. They were cannibals. My breathing quickened, and I felt my body tense. The police started investigating after a series of disappearances in the county. When the truth was uncovered, it was too late for many who had disappeared. The family was caught, but many bodies were not found, at least not at first. And here's the worst part. The water park is built right on the land where their cabin once stood. I felt a chill envelop me. And you think this cursed place, that it influences the events in the park? Sheriff Grayson looked me straight in the eyes, his expression serious and somber. I try to be unbiased. Recent events suggest that there is some underlying cause. At that moment, I couldn't hold back any longer and poured out everything I thought and felt about the moment Mike and Leah died. The sheriff listened attentively. I was ready for him to say that I had lost my mind, but unexpectedly, he accepted my paranormal version of the events. The wind suddenly picked up, and the old boards of the cabin creaked as if affirming his words. Suddenly, I felt my unease turn into fear, yet at the same time, a strange sense of determination took hold of me. "What can we do, Sheriff?" My voice trembled as I finished my story. The sheriff looked at me with newfound respect. "I don't know, miss, but I'm glad you're here. Maybe together we can change something." He continued to hesitate, not sure what to do. I said he could count on my understanding. Then the sheriff told me that the likely cause was that after the case was closed and the land sold, more remains of victims were found during the construction of the attraction. To not delay the building process and to stay within budget, all these remains were secretly reburied in a mass grave right where the greedy management decided to place this cursed new attraction with such a brutally ironic name, Cannibal Cabin. The sheriff confessed that the management had bribed the police to keep everything quiet. He shamefully lowered his head. I managed to muster something like, "I understand. Life is not a simple thing." He nodded. We stood looking at the cabin, which now seemed not just an abandoned building, but something more. A place where the past and present intertwined, creating a complex fabric of fates and fears that we had to unravel. Inside the cabin, there was a dead silence, but it was not peaceful. It was a silence filled with a lurking threat, as if the building itself was watching us. On the floor, there were signs that someone had recently been digging. The earth was damp, with clumps of mud sticking to it, and it emitted a faint, sweetly metallic smell. "They were buried here," Grayson said, his voice quiet but firm. "They're victims, people they killed for food." I didn't have time to respond when I heard something. It was a faint sound, as if someone had dragged their nails across wood. We both turned to the far corner of the room. There, in the dim light, barely discernible shadowy figures began to coalesce. "Do you see that?" I whispered, unable to look away. "Yes," Grayson replied, his hand reaching for his holster. "Don't move." The shadows became denser, taking shape. Soon, figures began to materialize before us. Their faces were blurred, but their eyes, oh, those eyes, they were bright, sinister, as if burning with an inner fire of hatred. Their silent mouths moved, but instead of words, I heard a hum, like thousands of voices screaming simultaneously. One of the figures lunged forward. Grayson managed to draw his pistol and fire, but the bullet passed through it, hitting the wall. The figure didn't stop. Its hands, twisted like charred branches, reached out to him. When it touched his chest, Grayson screamed as if struck by electricity. His body jerked, and he was thrown back against the wall. I screamed, but couldn't move from the spot. My legs were as if glued to the floor. I saw the sheriff trying to get up, his face contorted with pain. The figures did not retreat. They surrounded him, their movements sharp, unnatural, as if controlled by invisible strings. They reached out to him with their hands, gripping his shoulders, neck, and chest. "Get out," he rasped, struggling to break free from their grasp. "Run, Stephanie." I took a step back, but my eyes couldn't tear away from the horrifying scene before me. The figures began to kneel around Grayson, like a pack of predators encircling their prey. They dragged him to the floor, and I heard his scream fill the room. It was not just a scream of pain, it was a cry full of horror, despair, and the realization of inevitable doom. "Run!" His voice again tore through the silence, but I knew I couldn't help him. One of the figures lifted its head, its eyes meeting mine. There was nothing human in them, only hunger and hatred. It reached out to me, its movements jerky, like a puppet that had just come to life. That snapped me out of my stupor. I turned and ran towards the window. The door slammed shut with a bang, and behind me came a deafening screech, as if the walls of the house were moving. I reached the window and struck the glass. It cracked, but didn't break. In desperation, I hit it again and again until the shards flew. Climbing out, I fell to the ground, gasping for fresh air. Turning around, I saw the cabin. Its windows glowed with a dim, reddish light, as if it were burning from within. For a moment, I saw Grayson's silhouette, his arms raised as if trying to shield himself. His scream sounded one last time before the cabin swallowed him. Everything fell silent. The cabin returned to its former state, dark, abandoned, still, but I knew it was alive. It had taken Grayson, as it had taken all the others before him. I was left alone, consumed by guilt and horror. This land was cursed, and now I knew it better than anyone. After Sheriff Grayson's death, I couldn't return to aquatic paradise. Every corner of the park seemed alive, as if the walls and attractions were watching me. His death marked a point of no return. I was alone, the only one who knew the truth about what lay beneath this cursed place. The next day I tried to speak to the local authorities. They listened, but their faces were stone, as if they had already decided to do nothing. They dismissed me as crazy, saying that the sheriff's death was a tragic accident. No one wanted to believe what I was telling them. I knew I couldn't change anything. People would continue to come to the park, to laugh, to ride the slides, unaware that they were walking on land soaked in blood. But I also knew it wouldn't end there. The cabin had taken the sheriff, but it would want more. These spirits, enraged, hungry, would not stop until their story was known. The last time I walked past the cannibal cabin, its windows were lifeless, dark, but I felt it watching me. I whispered, "I know you're here," and left the park. Now I live with this truth. I'm haunted by nightmares, voices, the screams of those who were killed. I don't know what will happen next, but I feel that one day, aquatic paradise will face its reckoning. Land soaked in death can never be a place of joy. Now, let me share a moment from my life. I am an artist, and oil painting is both exciting and relaxing for me. About 8 years ago, I became so passionate about oil painting that I earned a Bachelor of Arts and now work as an art restorer in Barcelona. One day, I looked back and realized what knowledge I needed when I first started. So I prepared an intensive course of 14 visual and practical lessons for you. No talking heads or unnecessary chatter, just rich content that is immediately applicable in practice, all for the price of 1 day of car rental. Art therapy is a great way to cope with your anxieties. Link in profile or description.